This presentation covers the process of creating a magazine article for Stage 2 English. This is my final magazine article, and I produced this by looking at similar publications within the genre and analysing them for their stylistic features, language features, and context. The purpose of my article in this case is a preview. It's an initial impression of a yet-to-be-released video game, and it compares this game with previous entries into the franchise to determine whether or not it's worth getting excited about. The audience in this case are gamers who have a prior knowledge of previous games, particularly within the franchise. They're also familiar with game terminology and categories of review. In designing my article, I considered the stylistic techniques that I would use to meet my target audience and convey my purpose. In analysing a similar publication, I could see that the pieces were very visual, using images and image captions to draw attention and orient the reader towards the type of game we were looking at. I also noticed that the layout of text was deliberately set up in columns, which made the writing seem less invasive and more casual. And the infographic on the side gave us general information about the game, the platforms it was available on, its genre, and some of the publisher details that weren't mentioned in other parts of the article. Looking at all of these different elements that I was able to identify, you can see in this image how I've incorporated all of these visual and stylistic features into the design and layout of my own article to make sure it had a professional finish. I also considered the language of the text and looked through and identified by highlighting different language techniques and rhetorical devices I found in the text. Let me talk about only a few that I thought were quite common throughout. Comparison was a really common technique. You can see here written, the first and most impressive change is how Origins handles fighting. I brought a similar approach into my writing, stating that while it's still early days in discovering the expanded universe of Destiny 2, it's clear that there is more to offer in this title than its previous attempt. You can see in this case that I'm also using comparison with a previous entry in the franchise. Testimonial was also an important part of this, as the writer often used personal language to add opinion to the piece. I created this as well. I was thrown back into a world suffering under the invasion of the sinister Red Legion, with the brute leader Gaul having just stripped humanity's last remaining city of its guardians. While I've also brought in some emotive language in this case to create a sense of scale to the story, you'll notice that I also use personal language to show my engagement with the piece, creating a stronger connection to the reader. Examples were also commonly used, where the articles would give specific examples as to what the game experience looked like and felt like. In this case, when I said, multiple enemies and situations challenged the character to build on their gunplay and movement skills rather than simply powering through narrow corridors, I like to think I was able to create some vision and impression as to what the gameplay experience was actually like. When considering the context of the piece, I had to think really specifically about how I was going to write it to best suit the genre that I was trying to mimic within this task. In considering the field, I thought about how accessible the text was and the use of specialist language. Reading through, I could certainly see some inaccessible prior knowledge moments, such as specific reference to previous games or even obscure references like the point about Oliver Twist. I also found some other areas that were more generalised, making the language seem more accessible. And even though you might not understand anything about video games, generally I found that this piece was accessible to the broader audience, even though they might not understand some of the finer details. I created this same impression in my own writing. You can see that I've tailored it specifically to fans of particular series, which is inaccessible to the broader audience, but I've also talked into things like back into a world of suffering under the invasion of sinister Red Legion, which gives some background to the story for someone who might not be familiar with it. In terms of the tenor, I was looking for the use of personal language, things like I or you, or informal language that made more of a casual relationship with the reader. In looking through, again I found a mix between objective language that talked more formally and more personal language that created more of a relationship between the writer and the reader. I created a similar impression, where I was able to use personal language, improve my weapons until I was strong enough, but I also used some more objective language, suggesting how well this title stacks up to the success of the franchise. In regards to the mode, I also considered how written or spoken the piece was. In regards to this, I was looking at the type of vocabulary and the complexity of sentences. Once again, I found a mix between quite simple, short, dramatic sentences, but some more complex ones that drew out more complexity within the game itself. You can see that I also included a range of different sentence types and constructions, with simple rhetorical sentences used for dramatic effect, mixed with a broader vocabulary, saying things like greater satisfaction in multiple game modes and tight controls. I was really conscious of trying to mix up my adjectives to show greater range in my discussion. This was my final determination of the context of the piece. Altogether, my magazine article was effective in demonstrating the target audience and purpose that it was intended for, and my study of a similar publication allowed me to make sure that I was producing a clear piece that met the conventions of what I was trying to achieve.